When Paul asked me to do this talk, I really thought about, shall I only speak about salaries? Or is it more about, let's say, also scaling and scaling up? And how can you scale? And salary is perhaps a part of that, but I wanted to put it a little bit broader. So I thought, okay, how big can you think? It's a little bit about purpose, and also then how fast can you scale, or can you create an environment or a structure which allow you to scale afterwards. So that's the main topic, and I think we are all as typical scale-ups more or less in the same situation. Just a remark: this is not a TED talk. I don't sell books or don't tell the story all the time. But I really want to deep a little bit in those aspects of which I think they could be interesting for you. I'll tell something about the salary model, but I'll also tell something about our history. I also would like to show, let's say, our ways of thinking. I've called this thinking models. Then about clock building. How you really build companies, some examples. Then also diving deeper into the salary model process. How did we do it? And I'll also tell something about organizational structures, which we call primus inter pares. So first, I mean, this is probably a sheet you really like, because this is the end of the whole, let's say, outcome. Where in the end you have, let's say, 4 or 5 teams, and different salary schemes, and you have adjustments per year. But I will dive deeper into this model afterwards. But I just wanted to start with it to show you what let's say the conclusion of the whole process. But first I wanna go back, because what we see a lot is that people try to copy stuff, but it doesn't make sense to copy stuff. You have to go through the process yourself, because if you copy something and you don't do the work yourself, it doesn't work anymore. So first you have to understand where it comes from. And we, let's say, did a lot in the past, but we didn't talk about the whole model. So we implemented it the last, I think, 3 years, and we didn't talk about it, and then we started to talk about it, and then companies started to copy it, but then also problems evolved because they do the whole journey. So let me first do a very small introduction. Viisi, what do? We do mortgage advice in the Netherlands. We're 40 people now. 7,000 clients, 2.5 billion financed mortgage volume. Trustpilot score of 4.9 on a 5 scale. And we still own the whole company, which is exceptional. So that's, if you talk about scaling up, and we were in all those scaling programs. Amsterdam Center for Entrepreneurship program. Then we were in Scaling Up Nation, perhaps you know that, of Think. We were in the Euronext Tech Share program last year. So we did them all. Now we're also in this Tech Leap part involved. And we are founded 9 years ago. So it's not like just having founded the company a couple of months ago. It's pretty old-fashioned way of building a company. Paul already mentioned a little bit of awards. We don't do any, let's say, media stuff. So we focus on research and this kind of things. But you don't see us, let's say, in the press. Besides, if you read something about us, if it's about employer branding or other awards, like FD Gazelle, you probably know, this kind of growth metrics, but it's mainly about employer branding when you read something about us. Even much more than about mortgages. It's very funny. So we have much more media attention on our employer branding or what we do in that field than about mortgages, which sometimes the colleagues don't like because they say it would be much nicer for our revenues if they would write much more about mortgages, but we don't care so much. So about the mindset and the tools, and then afterwards I will give you some examples. What we really do is try to broaden the whole mindset in all different directions, and also think, let's say, the opposite, because sometimes it's much easier to do the normal stuff. Copying is let's say the best example of this, but it's much more interesting from an intellectual point of view to do exactly the other way around. So if somebody says you should be extremely big, then I think it's very interesting to see or to discuss or also ask the question, would be the opposite much more interesting? If you talk, for instance, about organizational design and self-organization, then small is beautiful. But sometimes you have it also in design. Less is more, as an example. So how big, how small, how far, how near, how fast, how slow, that broadens your mindset. Or if you talk, for instance, about decision making, our way we run states, it's a slow democracy. So you have a Senate, Eerste Kamer, that's to slow the process, to increase the quality. So it's not always about being fast or the fastest. Hardlopers and doorlopers, one say in the Netherlands. But so try to think as complex as possible, because all your competitors think in the same way. So if you just do the normal way of thinking, then the chance of really inventing something new is not as big as you would probably think in the end. So it's about stretching the mind. For those, for instance, who know MIT Media Lab or the Bono and this kind of stuff, to my point of view, much more interesting than the normal management literature. But that's always for us a starting point to dive into, let's say, thinking models, thinking the opposite. Perhaps always invert as a technique, or really think about stuff nobody would do. The book 0 to 1, perhaps you know, of Peter Thiel. A mechanism or a tool we also use a lot is to ask the question, would it work if the company would be 100 times bigger? If you talk about, for instance, exponential growth, the book of Yuri van Geest. But the example I also use from design thinking, reduced to the max or less is more, which is something, if you talk to designers or artists or writers, it's something very normal, but we don't use this a lot in management theory. So we make things enormous complicated, and we have huge difficulties with reducing stuff. And then you have purpose thinking or intrinsic stuff or intrinsic motivation or self-organizing systems, where if you, for instance, watch biology or complex systems, it's much more interesting to show examples from biology if you compare it with normal management theory, because it's just much more complicated. It's a little bit like people who have studied physics. They are much better in making models than people who have studied economics, for instance. I mean, I don't have to tell people who have studied engineering, but so it's more about how can you implement your complex way of thinking in organizations, because otherwise you won't find really good solutions. So the starting point was first to think about the building of the company. So for us, the starting point is purpose. And purpose for salary models is extremely important, because it's totally different if people join a purpose or if they join just a company because they want to earn money. So it always starts with the purpose for us. For us, we have a double purpose. On the one hand, this is to try to change the financial industry, but it's also about create a better organization. Then we discussed for a long time, or thought for a long time, what should be the hierarchy of the stakeholders. So that's a topic which has come back on the agenda. If you see the discussion in the US about, let's say, our shareholder value way of thinking. And years ago, we always said, it is not about shareholder value, it's always about our people. It's always about the long term. But we also put our people before our clients, which is also funny because we have a business-to-consumer company. And it's on our website. So the clients who approach us for their mortgage advice, they see that they are second. So you have to think about this, because otherwise, if you don't think about this, you would never start putting your clients second. Because then people say, oh, you can't put your clients second because your clients will not like it. But it's exactly the other way around, but it's a little bit more complicated. So we say if our own people are happy, then our clients will be happy as well. And then shareholders are last, which is something which sounds simple, but is lacking in the current model and causes a lot of harm. So that also means, for instance, that because we still own the company, we can act in a much more long-term oriented way, which sometimes is not very easy because you don't have money. So it would be much more easy just to ask for money and say, okay, finally we have all those problems solved and we can spend a lot on hiring and marketing, etc. But because we want to keep our independency, we always had to be very careful with our money. And it also helps, but I will come back to that afterwards. And for the capacity, it means that you can really focus on your own people and on clients, because you don't have to care about the other ones. You don't have to care about your shareholders who want to, let's say, your presentations all the time and ask you questions about the business they are not familiar with. So you can really focus on people and on your clients. That was the strategic idea behind it. What's also important, which I don't see a lot, is that we said, on the one hand, we want to change the financial industry, but our people are also part of our purpose. So the starting point always has been to create an environment in which everyone who works in our company can find its full fulfillment or potential, which has enormous consequences for your organizational structure. So the people who started our company, they stay at our company. So if we have fluctuation, that's in the beginning. But for instance, I'm one of the co-founders. I work together with my colleagues since 2002. So we are 2020 now. So, and it's over the time of certain companies. So we are quite some people from an old company where we used to work together. But it's always the idea of keeping the whole company together, keep everybody on board. It's not about changing in a different phase, management systems, and I listen to a lot of entrepreneurs who say, no, I need a totally new C-level management because for the next phase we need different people. No, we don't. So we want to really grow with our own people, and then we add other people to the team. It's a totally different approach, very old-fashioned. But it's also written, and it's also on our website. It's always start with our own people. But that also means that, for instance, if clients ask something, for instance, do you also advise me 10 o'clock in the evening or at Saturday, we just don't do. Because our own people are more important than our clients. And the funny thing is that the clients like that a lot, because they work somewhere where they also wanted to be treated first. And they are not, or often they are not treated like that. So it's very funny that perhaps you would think clients wouldn't like this. No, they like it because they work somewhere in an environment themselves. So I want to inspire a little bit to think about this. For instance, I don't like the whole idea of online business. In a lot of circumstances not. So because if you order 1 minute before 12 o'clock, I know that somebody who also has 2 children has to run through a huge hall to put stuff in a kind of parcel because I was too lazy to order it 3 days ago. And that's why I order it then 5 minutes before 12 o'clock before I go to bed. That's a totally different other human approach to care about your own people. Paul was very curious why I put this old picture in the presentation. It's about memento mori. So just to translate it to management literature, for those who know Stephen Covey, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, always start with the end in mind. And he didn't invent it himself. It's the old theme of philosophy, but also of religion. So in the Middle Ages, you used to have a skull on your desk to be remembered about your life. So, and it's also a personal theme for me, and I didn't talk about that in the past. But if people were always asking further, why are we so purpose-oriented, or I'm purpose-oriented? Probably there are 2 reasons for that. On the one hand, that I was very ill when I was 20. I had cancer, and I had a possibility of surviving it of 20%, and that makes it very easy afterwards, because you have finished your life and then you have extra time. So since 30 years I'm playing extra time, and it makes it much easier to be pretty decisive on a lot of stuff, because you just don't care about what people think or if they like it or not. And it's also, you're not focused very much on material things. So I'm not an entrepreneur to become rich or something like that. I don't care about that. I want to be independent and try to, let's say, the things I like or I think are right or should be done in a certain way. But it's not about being a unicorn or something like that. It's totally not. I find it uninspiring. So it's more about ethics. It's more about trying to build something. And I think a lot of people have this, but we also know it from our own education. So if you talk about ethics or religion, and especially in the Netherlands with the whole educational system, which is based on religion, I think for a lot of people it's very familiar that life is not about money. It's about doing something together which you like, and treat people like you want to be treated yourself. So that's for me entrepreneurship, and it's not about money. So that's a purpose, which is my personal purpose, but also the purpose of the company. And then you end up with people first. And now I just take one example to show how important it is to think about it a little bit more profoundly, and also use this kind of thinking models and do it totally the other way around, which often means that in the beginning it's much more complicated. So you're going the hard way, but in the long run, it gives you enormous competitive advantage, which is very difficult to copy for your competitors. So first thing is that normally in mortgage advice, people don't have university backgrounds. And we have a background as financial planners. and all have studied. So if you say, okay, mortgage advice, what's important or decisive is the quality, then also the starting point of the education of your people is decisive. And you see that again and again. So I started after my studies at McKinsey as a typical example of a company which just doesn't matter what kind of subject people studied, but they try to get the best people, and then they go further. So it's a totally quality approach. And also if you talk, for instance, about the development of your people, the old way of doing this is just hire young, we call it homegrown, and then do it internally. So that's something which small, medium-sized enterprises still do a lot. And then they just keep the best people. Although sometimes it would be very nice just to hire a couple of people who've worked at other companies just to fill the gap. But it also means, for instance, that you have to think about anti-cyclical strategies that you should, for instance, hire at times where there are enough people. Also, if you don't need them at that moment. There are a lot of important examples. I just think about Jim Collins, for instance, who took an example of the I think it was Boeing after the Second World War. They hired a lot of people who built military airplanes, and they said, oh, just hire all those brilliant people. We don't need them now, but we will need them in future. This is one example which comes to my mind. That's at the advisor side. At the back office side, we do exactly the opposite. So we don't hire young people, we hire, you would say from an HR point of view, expensive, very expensive, experienced people. So we have our own credit department. Normally, by the way, companies don't have that because they say we just give the mortgage to the bank and they should do the check. We have our own credit department from the beginning. And those people all have more than 10 years working experience. So there are four colleagues now, they all have more than 10 years work experience. So what discussions do we normally have? Why shouldn't we hire a much younger person who only costs half of it? No, do exactly the opposite. So it's always try to think about the opposite. And then also, let's say for future growth, we hire people, we call it virtual bench. We are always in talks with people years in advance. So, for instance, we are 4 co-founders and a colleague joined. He was the former CEO of a subsidiary of ING in Germany, of the biggest mortgage broker in Europe, and it's called Interhub. And this company does 40 times more than we do in the Netherlands. And I started talking to him, and the process took 2.5 years before he joined us. So, but that's for future growth, or thinking about different markets. So it's not like sometimes scale-ups say, okay, let's go to the US, and then somebody takes a suitcase and goes to the US. No, you should think about this years before, and then try to hire those people, get them onboarded, and then you can go there. So, for instance, we are not planning to go abroad, but we could go to Germany. We have enough people who have worked there. I lived there, worked there. It's not like, let's go abroad, let's look at LinkedIn, is there somebody we know? Because it doesn't, to my point of view, it doesn't work, or the risk is too high. And the other thing is for the Netherlands, they always talk a lot about flexibele schil. Eh? All those people around, we don't do this at all. So we insource everybody. So no ZZP'ers. Everybody should be really integrated in our company. And also feel, as we call this, visionaires. So also the one who does the cleaning is on our payroll and is in our pension scheme and is at the Christmas dinner. It's not, we don't want to have external people. Because somebody cleans differently if somebody knows what somebody is cleaning. And I find it very inhumane because if you have 3 minutes to clean a toilet, how should this be a proper clean toilet for your people? So it's often just do the other way around, or think it in a different way. I took another example, let's say more from the client side. I don't know if you know this example. It's from Brian Chesky, Airbnb. And there's an excellent podcast, interview done by Reid Hoffman, so the founder of LinkedIn. Masters of Scale, the podcast is called, and it's an excellent interview because he describes 11-star experience. And he describes what goes beyond, because normally you talk about 4 or 5 stars experience, and then he is describing what would be a 6-star experience, what would be a 7-star experience, what would be a etc., etc. And he ends up hiring a film team who films somebody who does this 11-star experience. So it's like flying somebody in, I don't know, to Los Angeles or San Francisco, and they're just following those person, and who arrives at an Airbnb, and the best restaurant is, a table is reserved for this person in San Francisco, etc., etc. And he describes this. But it's just to try to go beyond. And then he says, for instance, I think 11 experience would be somebody is taking a plane, arrives in San Francisco, Elon Musk is waiting for him with a rocket, and he will fly to Mars or something like that. But it's just to broaden beyond what's normal, or what you would be expecting as a client. So that's more from the client side. And the example I use a lot, or we always use, is when we do something, we'll always ask the question, does it still work when we're 100 times as big as we are now? And it's, let's say from a technical point of view, you talk about standardization, but it also has to do with exponential way of thinking. For instance, if you have hiring processes, and we'll come back to that afterwards, the question is, could you hire suddenly 1,000 people? Or can you talk to 1,000 people on a quarterly basis? Or if you have bonus schemes or this kind of stuff. And then you have to think in a different way. So that always helps. Or also if you have, for instance, if you should scale your production, if your production site, if you have an order and somebody orders the 100 amount 100 times more than you are able to produce at this moment, how you're going to solve this. And it doesn't mean that you can solve this at that moment, but at least asking yourself the question could be interesting. And an aspect which also helps, or helped us a lot, is to think about radical transparency, because it also helps you with scaling if everything is publicly available. So on the one hand, internally available, and on the other hand, also we go even further and do also share a lot of publicly. Because it's sometimes is a possibility also to make things simpler. So one example you often read about is the travel policy of Netflix. That's a very simple example of radical transparency, but makes it very simple, and you don't need any, let's say, department who is checking these travel expenses anymore. Because everybody can just dive into those travel expenses. Another aspect of scaling is this whole idea of self-organization or organizational teams, which in the end comes from biology. So it's it's the cell structure. It's not by coincidence it's called cell structure. So that also could be something to think about, because the growth curves of biological processes are totally different. It's not linear, it's exponential. So this kind of stuff all helps in the end to create a kind of environment where you are able to scale up afterwards if you have to. But I think it's a little bit easier to implement it gradually, because otherwise you will not able, let's say, to scale immediately, because it just takes certain time to adapt to those new rules or also new structures. And the example to go abroad is just one example. So if you want to become an international company and you know those markets you want to go to, it makes sense to hire those people in advance and then say, okay, do you want to work here? In 5 years we want to expand to, I don't know, Russia. And then you hire somebody who's Russian and lives here. And you can organize it, let's say, years before. But in the end, you have a very long list, and some things will work out, and others won't work out. But at least you have solved a part of the problem. Another example of making things on the one hand easier and also of being possible to scale things up afterwards is that what you normally see in companies is that if companies become bigger, it becomes more complicated all the time. So all those rules, they end up in huge handboeken, and we just said, no, we're trying to avoid this. How can we maximize it by reducing it on the other hand? And it also means we have only one rule. It's the golden rule: treat others like you want to be treated yourself. And we say the rest is common sense. So there's only one rule. And if you don't know what the rule is, just ask your colleagues. And probably you will find out. But we try to avoid to write things down. It's a little bit, if you study law, for instance, that also starts small, or tax law is also a very good example. From science point of view, you just should install a flat tax rate of 30%, and then that would be fine, and then you have some additions on that. But it's very difficult to get back to a very simple rule. So in the end, it's much simpler to end with very complicated models, and it's much more complicated to simplify. And it sounds very simple, but it's very complicated. So it's much easier if you are a small company to be aware of this and try to reduce to the max and really try to avoid this stuff, because adding stuff is the easiest thing to do. But it slows down your process afterwards. So, but it's in the end, it's about mindset. And the funny thing is, if you dive into these kind of mechanisms deeper, and I just took another example, this is from religion, the golden rule is in every religion. So if you end up with a lot of stuff, we often get the questions, oh, that's very exotic. And most of the time, it's not exotic. Most of the time, the very simple stuff is the stuff which is around everywhere. It's, for instance, also like multi-stakeholder. Multi-stakeholder is the model everywhere around the world. Because in the end, you should take into account that there are different stakeholders. It can't be only the shareholder. So from a starting point, you know that in a multi-stakeholder model, it will be much more focused on the long term than if you only take care of one stakeholder. But it's the same with people first. So now I would like to dive a little bit deeper in the salary model, but I hope that it gives you an impression that you can't just take out one part of it, implement it without, let's say, having a clear understanding of of the whole culture and what you're building in a company. And that's what we often see a lot. We also see it with self-organization. Okay, let's implement holacracy, or let's implement agile structures because it's more efficient. Now that's not the way it works. So you really have to do the homework first and to dive deeper into it, because otherwise it's just a kind of gimmick and it's not sustainable. So if you talk about salary models and you want to let's say build a new one, what did we do? Very practical. So the starting point is always science. And I've taken 3 examples which we took. On the one hand, everybody knows the Maslow pyramid. So it's about security. Then it's about what are people searching for. Perhaps you know the video of Daniel Pink. It's called Drive. I think it's one of the most downloaded or best viewed videos on YouTube. And it says that people are especially searching for purpose in their jobs, for autonomy, which you also see that people just want to decide themselves or together how they do the work. And it's about mastery. They want to develop their skills. They want to have opportunities. That's why a lot of people also want to be entrepreneurs. And another aspect which you see a lot in the press now is about psychological safety. So you have this project of Google where they found out, or they wanted to know which teams perform or have the best performance, and they just found out that psychological safety is very important because people can share their fears or their weaknesses, or they dare to ask. And that creates great teams. So if you want to build salary models, I think you have to start much deeper than how do you fill an Excel sheet. And if you know what you want to achieve, and that can be different, then you can build afterwards your salary model. What did we do? We did different things. On the one hand, we just did a kind of analysis, what models are there. On the one hand, in the financial industry, but there again, we did it differently. We also watched the salary models of the state, but also of the university hospital in Amsterdam, for instance. So they say, financial industry, why do you have a look at the salary models of the state or of a university hospital? So make it much broader, because most of the time, the insights you get from external benchmarking is much more interesting than from internal benchmarking. Because the banks were all thinking in this carrot and stick model. If I give you a bonus, you work harder. But science says exactly the opposite, that it's counterproductive. So it doesn't make sense if you work in the financial industry to benchmark other financial companies because they are all on the wrong track. So it's another, to my point of view, very good example. We had a very good look, for instance, at buurtzorg, because this is a very good example of a company which scaled enormously, 30,000 people now. That makes sense. How do they organize? Also, excellent example of self-organizing teams. So the interesting topic is, if you discuss it in the financial sector, people from the bank would say, why do you have a look at buurtzorg? But buurtzorg is much more interesting to watch than ABN AMRO or ING. So external benchmarking, especially perhaps industries or sectors, or for instance non-profit sectors, why are people willing to work in certain fields where people don't earn a lot of money? That's interesting. I mean, it's not difficult to benchmark McKinsey or Goldman Sachs. That's not difficult, because they pay the highest salaries. Now, why do one of people become teachers? That's also, for instance, something we saw, that teachers and people who are doctors have a totally different approach towards salaries. People who let's say have problems with their salaries are the people who earn most. It's very interesting. So in the financial industry, people complain a lot about their salaries, although they are the high earners. Yeah, that's an interesting scientific question. Why is that like that? And then after, let's say, doing this external benchmarking, you can then come back and then you organize the normal stuff. So we also hired Hey, and we also put the salaries in an Excel sheet, and we also had a look what are people doing, and then we took the curves of Central Bureau of Statistics and just said, okay, if somebody has an academic background and has graduated, what will people earn? And then you have this kind of salary models which you can just find online, and then you have the amount of years of experience, and then you can just make this curve which you already saw and what you see again. And then we did 2 rounds. We call it speed dates. And I still think you can do this in every company, no matter how big it is. You just take one team where you have not huge differences in salaries, and where you ask people, the first round was, what do you think about your own salary? Do you think it's okay, it's not okay? But try to get the topic, let's say, on the table and away from where people meet at the coffee machine. That's what we did. And the other thing we did was then afterwards, so we opened up afterwards, and we started when we were, let's say, between 15 and 20 people. So that's still, it would be one team probably in a company. And then we opened the salaries and said, what's your opinion about all the salaries in the team? With the same idea, are you able to activate these tensions and then solve them? Because now you have the idea, nobody is allowed to talk about it. You have a lot of tensions under the surface, and people discuss these topics, perhaps with their colleagues or at home, and complaining about it. But you want to solve them. It's also not very good for your productivity. Yeah? And the funny thing is that in the end you always have 3 situations, and it's in every company is exactly the same. You have some people who are a little bit beyond the curve, so they earn too much, perhaps, I don't know, 2 or 3 years, because they were good in negotiating their salaries when they entered the company, mainly men. And then you have people who are a little bit behind, often women, because they are not very good in negotiating their salaries. And sometimes you have people who have changed responsibility over time in the company. So their responsibility is much higher. They should have, let's say, one should have raised their salaries, but you didn't. Because their way of changing, we would say they changed the curves, but they were not adjusted. So they were still paid on their old curves, which is not correct. And we had these 3 situations. So we had a colleague who didn't get a pay rise then for 2 years. We had some other people who get some extra pay rises, and we had one colleague who is a colleague of mine. I work together with for 10 years now, and she started as our old, let's say, secretary, but now she's doing all the financial stuff with the accountants, etc. So she moved to from curve to curve, and we just didn't adjust their salary because it would be a big pay increase. But the funny thing is that all the colleagues said Esmee should earn much more, and she was adjusted then, I think 2 times 400 euro or something like that. So it's like, oh, how can you do such a big pay rise? Yeah, because she's on a different curve. But that would be exactly the same in other companies as well. And then afterwards you have those adjustment rounds. But what's also important is that what we also did were two things. On the one hand, we said on those curves, we always take the highest quartile, so the highest 25%. So we want to be a good employer. And the other thing is that we said if you have the impression that you're underpaid or salaries have changed in the market, just tell us, we'll check it and we'll adjust for the whole team. And that's something which happened. So the people who are in the credit department, when the mortgage sector boomed in the Netherlands, there were not enough people in the credit departments. And those experienced people we have, they said, we know from former colleagues that there are pay rises. Could you please check it? And then we adjusted it, I think 200 euros or something like that. But the interesting thing was that those experienced colleagues said it had been more important that we did do this than the rise itself. And why? Because it's about culture. So one colleague said, I've heard so many stories and I've worked in different companies and they always promised stuff, but they never acted on that. So, and that was very interesting, which I didn't realize myself. I thought, okay, somebody would be extremely pleased because of the pay rise. No, it was not about the pay rise. It was about the trust and just act what you promised, which I found very, very, very interesting. So, and then you're ending up again with something which seems to be very simple, that you have just those curves and you have a starting point. So if somebody, I just take as an example the advisory or the consultants who advise clients, they start at 3,250 euros. It must be around a traineeship kind of salaries. And then you have 35 or 40 years. And then we said, every year you get 200 euros more. But the interesting thing is, that's independent of any purpose, of any performance issues. And that's something which is not written a lot about it, because that's something people are very unfamiliar with. Because they always have the idea that salaries and performance should be connected to each other, which is not the case. So underperformance is not solved by money. That's something we know from science. And we also know that, let's say from organizational stuff, that peer pressure is much more efficient than vertical feedback. So performance issues are solved, let's say, on the horizontal peer-to-peer pressure, which also means that people are hired in the teams by the people themselves. So there's another example. You can just copy a salary model, but if you don't take into account that in our company, teams hire their own people, and everybody should be, let's say, okay with that. So in the team was 4 people. If somebody has a veto, somebody is not hired. Which means that if somebody is hired, everybody supports this colleague, but they also have a daily meeting. So if somebody, let's say, doesn't behave in a team way, then there will be this peer pressure, and you can't stand peer pressure. That's anthropology. So these aspects also play a very dominant role. So you just can't take these curves and say, okay, let's just take the curves from the CBS, Central Bureau of Statistics, and then implement it. To my point of view, it's a little bit more complicated. And to come back to the purpose, now Bregman is very well known for his other books. But we always gave people who started as consultants this book when they entered the company. It's about being humble, because it means to be aware of the fact that we are totally overpaid in our sectors. And so we say, okay, it's nice we work in the financial sector, but we're overpaid. We should be more humble about this. And so people who are teachers or doctors or nurses, they deserve to be much better paid, and we should pay less in comparison. And that's something which is something totally different. I also like to give those books when I have appointments with other people from the financial sector. They always get these books. But today is a very interesting day because Hamers just left ING because his opinion is that he's underpaid for ING. So we have a purpose approach, which means, and that's why it is important also for scaling, if you focus on the purpose, you hire people who come for purpose. So if you want to, let's say, change mobility or change world problems, or if you produce chocolate, I think people join Tony Chocolonely because they want to change something. If they want to earn money in the fast-moving consumer goods sector, they should work for Unilever or Danone or this kind of stuff. So I think purpose also has a very, very fundamental effect on your hiring policy, which also means that, let's say, when people want to maximize, for instance, their salaries, they probably don't approach us. Because, I mean, we are in the highest quartile, but there are always people, perhaps as individuals, who could earn more. But we won't notice it because those people, they don't come to us. And when people, let's say, when people are hired or when people approach us, the salary is always known in advance. So if we have, if people approach us and say, okay, I would become an advisor, they know from their own LinkedIn profile, if they just move, let's say, 2 or 3 years, they can just add those 200 euros times 3, and they say, okay, then probably I will earn, I don't know, 3,750. And before the whole round starts, the salary is already told to the person. So we don't have a salary negotiation at the end of the hiring process. It doesn't exist. It's totally different way around. Which also means, for instance, that we don't have any discussions about equal pay because we don't have different curves. It's always the same. Somebody also asked about the share program. It's also funny, took us 2 years. That's the conclusion. Everybody who works in the company gets 1 point per year. That's all. Which means if we would sell the company, 10% of the value is divided by the amount of points, and that's it. Now, that sounds very simple, but it's very complex because you have a lot of discussions going on. What do we do with people with different salaries? Because the answer is we don't care all the time. Is there a difference between people who joined the company earlier or later? Is there a difference between people who only work 80 or 60%? What do we do with people who go on sabbatical, etc., etc.? We all had these discussions, but because of the fact that we are very long-term oriented, we say, okay, if somebody works for us 20 years, probably somebody has worked in between less hours, when people have children, for instance, has been on sabbatical, I don't know, took a year off or something like that, but just let's adjust or just assume that everybody has done in those 20 years. So you have a huge complex formula, and then you just skip on every side, you skip the complexity out of the whole model again. And it's always very funny when I talk to entrepreneurs and we talk about share programs. They explain how they do and what they've invented, and then they ask, and what's your model? Say everybody 1 point per year. That's it. So it sounds easy, but it's difficult because in the end, in our company, people have to, let's say, accept it because we're self-organizing. So if there is an adjustment in the salary model, the whole company decides it. Integrated decision making. So it's not somebody has an idea, let's do it like that. No, it takes time. But if you have a lot of discussions going on and you have a lot of time, it doesn't matter when certain discussions go on for 2 or 3 years. And it's not that we're discussing this topic all day. No, sometimes it comes back and then we say, we don't know yet. Let's just think about it. It just takes time. So you have a lot of parallel processes. And the last I wanted to take as an example is primus inter pares. I'm a historian. And I find management underdeveloped as a science, which for me is very normal because management exists for 100 years. And the way we build states exists for 2,000 or 3,000 years. So we had 20 or 30 times more time to develop the way we build states. And primus inter pares is a rotation principle of leadership. So in our company, it's not about strong leadership, it's about strong structures. And we implemented primus inter pares principle, which means that if you have a team of 4 people, every half a year somebody else is in charge of what we call resources. Which sounds strange, but it's a very old principle. But which also means that you have to organize your whole structure differently. Sometimes you see it in also in IT companies that they are more advanced because they already have understood there that you have to solve your Peters principle. And a lot of software developers just don't want, for instance, be a manager. But the whole idea still is somebody does a good job and then this guy or woman should be in charge of the rest for a long time, and then it doesn't work out and then somebody has to leave the company. So that's something we also experiment with, but it's a very old principle. But the funny thing is always that we are asked, how did you come up with something so exotic? And I feel the other way around. And I just took one example, or 2 examples. One from the past. This is the Senate of Hamburg. But it's the same in the Netherlands. That we have a republican tradition, and our cities were governed by citizens. It's a typical team culture. We don't have a royal tradition. I mean, we are a monarchy, but we still have a republican way of organizing. Nachtwacht Nightwatch is also a very good example. But the other example, and people don't know this, for instance, the Swiss government still works like that. And it's also probably one of the most interesting democracies or systems to watch, because it's all self-organizing and decentralized. So, for instance, the tax system in Switzerland, you pay local taxes and you get a bill for the city. You get from the canton or from the province, you would say in the Netherlands, you get a bill and you pay state taxes and you know exactly which amount you pay for what. And in your local community, you have to decide how the money is spent. So, for instance, if you live in Delft, you have to decide as a citizen if let's say the swimming pool, the public swimming pool is renovated, or if they want to build something for elderly people, etc. People have to vote on this all the time. But they also have the rotation principle, primus inter pares. So this is the Swiss government. It exists of all the parties. All the parties are in the government, which for us is very strange to understand. I don't know. Somebody who has won the election should decide what the whole, let's say, a country has to obey to this kind of policy. But every year somebody else is in charge. So you have a government, and then somebody is for 1 year, and then the prime minister is the next person. But it's very old principle, essence, more than 2,000 years old. But we have such a focused idea of one strong leader who is going to solve this in a team or a company. But we also know from science, for instance, that's not a very good idea. That if you give people, for instance, a lot of power, the chance that it's going in the wrong direction or you take the wrong decisions is much higher. So the intelligence of a group and rotation principles is much more intelligent than the way we're organized now. So there are enough examples of this. But what I just wanted to show you, that on the one hand, you see in articles very simple solutions, but it doesn't make sense to copy a lot. It makes much more sense to dive into these topics yourself and then just see what works or doesn't work. Because probably for your own company, you have different examples. So for instance, if you take Lightyear, I would dive, for instance, into the history of Philips, because there are so many excellent examples which you can take. If you, for instance, talk about caring about your people, Philips is an excellent example. So you don't have to talk about Elon Musk all the time. Or if you are in Delft, you should read the book about Von Marken, Gisprocades, which was one of the most brilliant entrepreneurs there ever was, because then you feel much more connected to your history. Because what happens all the time now is that we fly to Silicon Valley. I also did with Amsterdam Center of Entrepreneurship. We're going to watch what they are doing there, but the solution often is just around the corner, and it's much easier to connect with your own history. That as a final remark, as a historian who ended up in finance. Thank you.